Welcome to Joe's Productions. Today we're going to take a look at the second part of the progressive movement, and we're going to examine Woodrow Wilson's foreign policy. This video is going to help you with any APUSH textbook you're using, but that's how it lines up to some of the popular ones. Keep in mind, when we last left off, the Republican Party was divided, and it's really during Taft's presidency that the Republican Party divides, and it's really between the supporters of Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft. And there's a couple of events that take place to cause this division. One, Taft supports the Payne-Aldrich Tariff of 1909, which raised the rates of the tariff. And really, progressives within the Republican Party don't want this to occur. They wanted to see the tariff decrease, if anything. A bigger event actually takes place with the Pinchot-Ballinger controversy when Taft fires Roosevelt's homie, the chief of the Forest Service, Gifford Pinchot. Remember, he was one of the big conservationists, and he's fired because he criticizes the Secretary of the Interior, Ballinger, who Taft supports. And the reason why Pinchot criticizes him is because Ballinger opened up public lands in Alaska to private development. And for conservationists, this seems like the administration had sold out on the issue of conservation. So in 1912, there's a big old debate in the Republican Party. Taft wins the Republican nomination, and you can see it was split in half. Roosevelt's not going to back down, though. He forms his own political party known as the Progressive Party, or more commonly referred to by its nickname, the Bull Moose Party. And really, he runs on a program called New Nationalism, in which he wants an active federal government pursuing a wide variety of reforms. And he's going to throw his support behind every major progressive issue, from women's suffrage to breaking up bad monopolies. The Democrats pick a guy by the name of Woodrow Wilson, who had a reputation for cleaning up politics in New Jersey. He runs on a progressive platform of new freedom, once again also calling for reforms, but especially tariff reform, bank reform, and antitrust laws. The Socialist Party runs a candidate, Eugene Debs, remember the guy during the Pullman strike, and the reason the Socialist Party is really important in this election is it demonstrates the growing frustration over the slow pace of reforms. Many people wanted more change in American society, and the Socialists were the most radical proponents because they called for more radical reforms than most progressive candidates, including public ownership of the major industries such as the railroads, steel, oil. Well, when you have two Republicans against one another, it pretty much guarantees that the donkeys, the Democrats, are going to win, because in 1912, Woodrow Wilson wins the presidency. And really, under Wilson, progressive era reforms are going to continue, but he wants to assault what was referred to as the triple wall of privilege: tariffs, trust, and banks. And so you're going to see that take place under the presidency of Wilson. Tariff reform, the Underwood Tariff, is passed in 1913, which lowered the rates of tariffs. It's the first major tariff reduction in 50 years, so this is a big win for those people who did not like high tariffs, like farmers, for instance. When it came to trusts, a couple of reforms you should know about: the Federal Trade Commission in 1914, which basically allows presidential appointed commission would investigate monopolies. An important thing to keep in mind is that it exempted labor unions from being prosecuted. And of course, the Clayton Antitrust Act is passed in 1914, which increases the power of the Sherman Antitrust Act. So more regulation, federal regulation of monopolies. Banking reform is probably Wilson's most notable domestic achievement under the Federal Reserve Act. And the reason why the Federal Reserve Act is passed is there's this belief that the gold standard was too inflexible. And what this would do is the Federal Reserve, the Feds, would be responsible for regulating the money supply. And there was this feeling that previous economic panics, such as the Panic of 1901, demonstrated the problem of a limited money supply. So there was a desire to have the Federal Reserve be able to supervise the whole thing, issue Federal Reserve notes, printing paper money so that the money supply could be increased or decreased as needed. And this is a huge change in banking, along with the 16th Amendment, which allows for the income tax to be established. And recall, the Populist Party wanted this income tax to be put into place. So these are Wilson's big achievements. So there you see Wilson kind of washing up the trust with the Sherman Antitrust Act and other laws, but there's also smaller ones you should be aware of. The Federal Farm Loan Act of 1916 allowed for low rate loans to farmers, so farmers are getting a little bit of help. And the Child Labor Act, which prohibited interstate commerce of products made by children. Now, an area you should really make sure you know about is the failure of the progressive movement when it came to African American civil rights. And this goes beyond Woodrow Wilson, because most progressive reformers were not interested in advancing the cause of social justice or extending democracy to African Americans. In fact, African Americans were oftentimes largely ignored by progressive era politicians. From Roosevelt on, not much in the way of civil rights advances. In fact, as a whole, there are going to be very little protests to the rise of lynching in the 1890s or the existence of Jim Crow laws. Remember, Plessy versus Ferguson happens in 1896. And so an important thing to keep in mind, since African Americans lack mass support from the progressives, they're going to advocate for themselves. And there's a couple of different people that you need to be aware about. We've already met Booker T, but a quick review, never hurt anybody. Remember in 1895, Washington gives his Atlanta Exposition speech in which he outlines his vision. And really that vision was African Americans should acquire vocational skills to gain self-respect and economic security. To achieve this goal, he establishes Tuskegee Institute, and he is not going to be an advocate for directly challenging white supremacy. He felt that economic independence would eventually lead to political and social independence. And some of his critics, such as the guy we're going to meet in just a second, accuse him of being an accommodationist. The other big figure in the civil rights movement is W.E.B. Du Bois. He writes his very influential The Souls of Black Folk. He rejects Booker's gradualism, and he demanded immediate political and social equality for African American people. He's a figure in the Niagara movement, where a group of civil rights leaders meet at Niagara Falls, and they kind of eventually turn this movement into something called the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in 1909, the NAACP. Ida B. Wells is a very important figure you should also know about. She is going to be a very vocal advocate against lynching and also women's suffrage and in general just civil rights as a member of the NAACP and other organizations. Another key thing you should keep in mind is the role of women. And although women were playing a more active role in the progressive era, they are not always supported by progressive era reformers. One example is the issue of suffrage. Woodrow Wilson is not going to be an advocate for an amendment granting women the right to vote, and women were advocating on their own. In fact, the National American Woman Suffrage Association, NASA, was headed by Carrie Chapman Catt. She becomes the president during this period, and she favored fighting for suffrage, the right to vote, with a state-by-state strategy. Basically, win the right to vote in individual states, and eventually you would have enough that national politicians such as Wilson would support giving it to women in the entire country. This was not supported by all members of NASA, and one important figure that you definitely need to know about is Alice Paul. She breaks away from NASA and forms the National Woman's Party in 1916. They are much more militant. They're going to protest in front of the White House before and during World War I. And their big goal is a national amendment granting women the right to vote. And eventually this will take place with the 19th Amendment. Wilson, like I said, will not initially support this, but eventually it will pass. So wrapping up the kind of progressive movement, keep in mind all of these presidents are all going to seek reform at the national level, and there's going to be varying degrees of success and failure. Another important topic is Wilson's foreign policy. And remember, the U.S. was increasingly pursuing an aggressive foreign policy in places such as Asia and Latin America. We saw McKinley with the open door policy, Roosevelt with his big stick policy, Taft with dollar diplomacy. Wilson's going to shift direction with a policy called moral diplomacy. And part of what moral diplomacy was, and you could see this in the political cartoon, is that Wilson wanted to promote democracy to other countries. He also wanted to pursue less imperialistic policies. You're going to see an improvement of relations between the United States and countries such as the Philippines and Panama. However, Wilson isn't going to be immune from wanting to intervene in other countries' affairs. And the best example is what Wilson does in Mexico. Little context for you. Mexico had a revolution, the Mexican Revolution, and it removes the dictator Porfirio Diaz from power. And the U.S. cares about Mexico because we had a lot of investments in Mexico. And revolutions typically are not very good for business. There's rotating leadership in Mexico. Various people are trying to kind of assume power, and there's a power struggle that takes place, and eventually there's a guy by the name of Huerta who becomes the leader of Mexico. And he was kind of a military dictator, and Wilson does not like him. He refuses to recognize his government. He calls it a government of butchers. And one of the things Wilson does is he orders an arms embargo, keeping weapons from getting to the Huerta government, and he starts giving aid to revolutionaries fighting Huerta, some of those by the name of Carranza and Pancho Villa. Well, things get a little heated because American soldiers are arrested by Mexican officials at Tampico. It's known as the Tampico incident. Those are the guys who were arrested, and there's this period where Mexico's not apologizing in the manner that we would like, and U.S. naval forces occupy the Mexican port of Veracruz. Frustrated with U.S. involvement in his country, a guy you see in the middle right there, Pancho Villa, leads a series of raids across the border, killing American citizens in Texas and New Mexico. And in 1916, Woodrow Wilson sends in General John J. Pershing and the expeditionary forces into Mexico to apprehend Pancho Villa. They're unable to arrest him, and the countries are very close to war, and the only thing that really kind of stops it from possibly occurring is the growing threat of war in Europe causes Wilson to remove the troops. And that leads us to the big thing, the Great War, World War I. We're not going to talk about the causes. There's a variety of factors that contributed to the outbreak of World War I. You know, most people think of them as main militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. Of course, the immediate cause is the assassination of Franz Ferdinand in June of 1914. World War I begins. It's important you keep in mind our reaction to the war is we advocate a policy of neutrality. Even more important is that you understand that U.S. neutrality was very difficult to maintain. The struggle is real. A couple of things. The United States was never completely neutral during World War I. What the heck does that mean? From the start, we had a stronger connection to England than Germany. We shared a language. We have legal and political institutions. They used to be our mama. In fact, American public opinion was largely anti-German, even though there's a lot of German immigrants in America at this time. Largely anti-German for a variety of reasons. One, the autocratic government of the Kaiser. They don't have a democratic system. The fact that they invaded Belgium. Propaganda, especially from England, like the poster you see right there. And of course, that history with the Allies, France and England namely, draws us much more to the Allied cause. Another reason is American manufacturers, bankers, and investors heavily sided with the Allied cause. Both England and France greatly benefited from trade and loans from the United States. And so we are giving a lot of money to the Allies, and England used its superior navy to blockade any trade from the United States or any country from entering Germany. So you see from the start, U.S. is financially invested in the Allied cause. What starts happening is Germany decides to resort to unrestricted submarine warfare using U-boats, submarines, and they start sinking a series of ships. Some of the notable ones is the Lusitania, a British passenger ship. It sunk in May of 1915 off the coast of Ireland, killing almost 1,200 people, including 128 Americans. Germany does apologize and pledges not to sink any more neutral ships. Things calm down for a moment, but then Germany sinks other ships, including that one you see right there in March of 1916. Wilson once again threatens to cut off diplomatic relations with Germany, and the U.S. and Germany are very close to war. You could see Uncle Sam is frustrated in the political cartoon, demanding that Germany stops, and Germany does issue the pledge, where Germany promises we won't sink any more ships without warning those aboard. The big issue in the election of 1916 when Wilson's running for re-election is the fact that he kept us out of the war. He reminds voters that he was the one who kept us out of war, and he easily wins re-election. However, the following year, the U.S. will find itself in World War I, but we'll cover that another day, another time. Thank you for watching the video. If it helped you at all, click like. If you have any questions or comments, post them in the comments section. If you haven't told all your friends, make sure they subscribe to Joe's Productions, and have a beautiful day. Peace. Observation. So in 1912, there's a big old debate in the Republican Party. Taft wins the Republican nomination, and you can see it was split in half. Roosevelt's not going to back down, though. He forms his own political party known as the Progressive Party, or more commonly referred to by its nickname, the Bull Moose Party. And really, he runs on a program called New Nationalism, in which he wants an active federal government pursuing a fires Roosevelt's homie, the chief of the Forest Service, Gifford Pinchot. Remember, he was one of the big conservationists, and he's fired because he criticizes the Secretary of the Interior, Ballinger, who Taft supports. And the reason why Pinchot criticizes him is because Ballinger opened up public lands in Alaska to private development. And for conservationists, this seems like the administration had sold out on the issue of that the Republican Party divides. And it's really between the supporters of Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft. And there's a couple of events that take place to cause this division. One, Taft supports the Payne-Aldrich Tariff of 1909, which raised the rates of the tariff. And really, progressives within the Republican Party don't want this to occur. They wanted to see the tariff decrease, if anything. A bigger event actually takes place with the Pinchot-Ballinger controversy when Taft Welcome to Joe's Productions. Today we're going to take a look at the second part of the progressive movement, and we're going to examine Woodrow Wilson's foreign policy. This video is going to help you with any APUSH textbook you're using, but that's how it lines up to some of the popular ones. Keep in mind, when we last left off, the Republican Party was divided, and it's really during Taft's presidency wide variety of reforms, and he's going to throw his support behind every major progressive issue, from women's suffrage to breaking up bad monopolies. The Democrats pick a guy by the name of Woodrow Wilson, who had a reputation for cleaning up politics in New Jersey. He runs on a progressive platform of new freedom, once again also calling for reforms, but especially tariff reform, bank reform, and antitrust laws. The Socialist Party runs a candidate, Eugene